Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan, joined as always by my friend
Juan, and we're back with Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. On to episode number 2 today, the revolutionary Lenin.
Yeah, so last time we learned about the theories of Marx, who, as our listeners now know, was German, not actually Russian. And we see these theories put into practice almost 70 years after he came up with them. That raises the first point, which is Marx's ideas were not popular. We get the idea that communism is kind of like power to the people, but that's never really true. It's only the spoiled children of the elites who are attracted to the theories of Marx, and that was what happened in Russia and led to the Russian Revolution.
It's a fascinating story what happened in Russia, because you had a good government under the Tsars and some really good things happening there. And unfortunately, then Tsar Nicholas II comes in, and he's sort of a weak leader, somebody that's really not leading the country. You know, he's essentially forced into World War I, and then he abdicates his reign. And that's when the Bolsheviks attack. We can all see that in states and in the places we work, that whenever you have a weak leader or a vacuum of leadership, that's when everybody pounces on it.
Yeah, and as Dr. Connor points out in the lecture, Nicholas was a good man, a good father, but not only was the war thrust upon him, but even the czarship was thrust upon him. He wasn't someone who sought power, and entering the war was the worst thing he could have done. Just think of it from a practical perspective. You take the hardy and courageous, the brave young Russians, the kind of people that help provide stability in a country, and you throw them out into the trenches of World War I. They're killed in large numbers. Even those who aren't killed are away from home, and it made the regime vulnerable to this, as Churchill called this virus of Leninism.
Yeah, something that I remember Dr. Grant mentioning once that I never knew was that the Bolsheviks were not a majority. So when they come and they take over Russia, it was really a minority that was just very loud and very violent and forced itself upon the country and dominated it for decades after that.
So that's what we'll learn in this episode about how the Bolsheviks, the communists, came to power in Russia and what their regime was like shortly after the war until Lenin's death. If you're enjoying learning with us, I encourage you to explore all of the offerings that we provide at Hillsdale College Online Courses. As always, everything is free. You can listen to the podcast and learn that way, or you can go to our website, which you can access at hillsdale.edu/course, and view all of our over 40 courses. These are on topics ranging from literature to theology, politics, fine arts, math and science. We provide lectures, which are shot in beautiful video. There are study guides for the lectures to help you get the most that you can out of them. There's quizzes to help you test your retention. And we also have links to buy books that are featured in the courses if you want to continue your learning. I always think that is the ideal scenario. We introduce a topic, we let one of our fine professors guide us through an introduction, and then the student goes and continues their learning by tackling the book and mastering it themselves. So please continue to learn with us. Go to hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course to learn more.
Now let's turn to Marxism, Socialism, and Communism, Episode 2, The Revolutionary Lenin.
Vladimir Ulyanov, or Lenin, as his codename was operated, was effectively the founder, if not of the Russian Marxist movement. He was certainly the originator and founder of the Bolshevik faction.
Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was a Russian man that was highly drawn in the late 19th century and the early 20th century to Marxian ideas, was very much drawn to these kind of radical socialist ideals. And he was writing all the time, developing his thought patterns. And he was quietly plotting on how to bring about socialism to Russia.
The thing that made Lenin successful is his iron will and determination.
Lenin adapted Marxism to his own purposes in the middle of World War I. When Lenin sensed the moment was ripe to seize power in November 1917, he went for it.
сущность этой новой власти, которых не хотят и не могут понять еще в большинстве стран. Сущность ее, привлекающая к себе рабочих.
Despite Lenin's strategic timing, the key to communism taking root in Russia was not that the Bolshevik Party was powerful and influential. It was not that the people supported Marxist ideas. The key to Marxism taking root was the weakness of the Tsarist regime of Nicholas II.
Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Imperial Russia, was a member of the Romanov family or dynasty, which dated back ultimately to 1613. He was perhaps less well prepared than he might have been. His father, Alexander III, was seen by everyone as vigorous, extremely healthy. His illness came on quite suddenly, his death was quite unexpected, and so I think Nicholas II was both kind of shocked and a little bit unprepared when he first ascended to power. He was a devoted father and family man, and in many ways a very decent and well-minded, well-intentioned character.
When his father died suddenly in 1894, Nicholas was supposed to have said to a friend, "I don't know how to be Tsar. I don't want to be Tsar. Basically, how am I ever going to do this job?"
My dearly beloved wifey, thank you for your dear letter. It was terrible seeing you go away with the girls. Immediately went into our train, and I took him into your coupe and let him smell your pillow. And he shyly remarked that he felt sad without you. Then I kissed him and told him to go and play, promising to take him for a little walk with me at the next station. Of course, I was occupied with my beastly papers. Always yours, Nicky.
He was weak, excellent father, but in the Russian political system, he was supposed to be the father not just of his family, but of the whole country. But Nicholas was a very weak reed to vest that power in. He was 26 years old when he became Tsar. And Nicholas also never believed that he was his father's equal, and therefore never did Nicholas believe that he had the requisite strength to be the Tsar.
He didn't really have the inner self-confidence. He hesitated. In the end, I think he allowed himself often to be bullied or badgered by his advisors, such as the fateful decision to go to war in 1914, and once again to back down and abdicate in 1917. I think when push came to shove, he lacked a certain will to power.
Nicholas II was a weak ruler. And yet, even under his reign, Russia underwent rapid economic and social progress. It would require a disastrous sequence of events to uproot the growth under his rule, and eventually lead to the utter collapse of the entire regime.
Russia had been attempting to modernize, especially since about the mid-19th century. They'd made a lot of progress in that way, but there was still unhappiness with that. Not just Marxists, but any number of revolutionary groups floating around, assassinating Tsarist officials. Sort of a predecessor event that showed the fragility of the regime was the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. The Russians lost. This brought out all of these tensions, and there was a revolution in 1905. Very violent, very nearly successful. Wasn't particularly a Marxist revolution, but you might say leftist in general. People wanted to get rid of the Tsar. That was narrowly repressed, and some very successful reforms. It looked like Russia was really doing well. The Tsar had probably best minister he ever had, a man named Stalin, strengthened the Tsarist regime and did reforms that benefited people. What Stalin said, what you can't do is go to war. That's the one thing we can't do. We have to have peace.
Russia was the economic story of the day before 1914. This colossal economic growth. The German chancellor told his son shortly before the outbreak of the First World War not to plant trees on the family estate in East Prussia because only the Russians will benefit, he said, because the expectation was that Tsarist Russia was this kind of colossus, economic growth rates approaching 10%.
Russian economy was exploding in a good way. They were industrializing in a relatively painless way. Technology increasing greatly, but it was still fundamentally an agrarian society. About 80% of Russians were peasants.
Pyotr Stalin, the great statesman of the decade or so before the war, was assassinated in September 1911, which was a very, very significant blow, I think, to the regime. He spoke in 1909 of what he called the need for 20 years of peace. The regime could carry out certain piecemeal social reforms and allow economic growth, eventually to create a larger class of both peasant smallholders, middle-class people with something to lose who would resist the siren song of revolution. In the end, I think the critical decision was actually made by Tsar Nicholas II when he gave the order for general mobilization, an order he initially actually rescinded. He said, "I will not be responsible for a monstrous slaughter." Unfortunately, he was badgered by his advisors all day the next day until he finally succumbed about 4 p.m. on July 30th. It was not so much the sovereigns, although they took the formal responsibility, as the military chiefs and civilian politicians who all argued some version of the same thing, that we cannot back down, that we cannot appear weak, that notions of honor and national prestige were in play. There's no telling exactly how Russia would have developed, but I don't think there's any scenario in which Lenin comes to power absent the mass slaughter of the First World War.
A few days ago, we notified the Russian people about the war Germany had declared on us. The enemy's strength increases. The both mighty German powers have taken arms against Russia and the whole Slavdom. But in double strength grows against them peaceful nations, justified anger, and with invincible fortitude raises Russia. Challenged on the battlefield, against the enemy, faithfully following the glorious traditions of her past. May the Almighty God bless our weapons, and those of our allies, and may the whole Russia rise to heroic deeds in the war with iron in hands and cross in heart.
The First World War was an utter debacle for Russia long before the revolution finally tore its way through the social fabric in 1917. As early as 1915, when the Germans first made a major breakthrough on the Eastern Front, after which they proceeded to occupy much of Russian Poland and push on into the Baltic region, already then there were rumors swirling of various palace coups against the government.
The average Russian did not see the point of dying fighting, the Austro-Hungarians or Germans in the area of, say, Western Ukraine or something like that. Is what are we doing here? There wasn't a food shortage, but sometimes it wouldn't be where it needed to be, and causing dissatisfaction and things like that.
Tsar Nicholas II tried to shore up morale by taking over personal command of the armies. And in the end, the German offensive simply ran out of momentum, and the Russians were able to consolidate defensive lines.
The thing that made Marxism possible of being successful in Russia was, above all else, World War I, the catastrophic effects of that war, and the assistance of the German regime for the Bolsheviks.
Despite the unpopularity of the war, the Tsarist regime held together until 1917. However, by the beginning of that year, widespread disapproval among average citizens, dissatisfaction among the elites, and mutinies among rear echelon troops ultimately culminated in the February Revolution.
So the February Revolution took place in Russia in 1917. According to our calendar, it took place in March. It led to the collapse of the Tsarist Russian regime. Unlike the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks were not directly involved, and the Bolsheviks did not come to power in its wake.
The people who brought about the February Revolution were overwhelmingly the Russian equivalent of Western progressives. They wanted a stronger parliament, and a lot of this push came from leadership in the Russian parliament, which did not have very much power under the Tsar. They wanted it to be powerful, like the British or French parliament.
The February Revolution was, in some ways, a broader popular uprising, although in the end, the critical factor was an army mutiny which toppled the Tsarist government in Petrograd. There are certain paradoxes in the story of the Russian mutinies of 1917. To begin with, there's a huge difference between the frontline armies and the rearguard units, particularly of the Petrograd garrison. Generally speaking, whether it's the army or the navy, men who are busy, that is, they are in action, they are either fighting the enemy or preparing to go on the offensive or preparing for battle, their morale tends to hold. There might be grumbling, there might be grievances. And those armies, the ones most directly involved in the fighting in the winter of 1916-17 or preparing for spring offensives, generally speaking, morale was fine in units in Galicia. The closer the army got to Petrograd and the northern units, to some extent the closer they were, at least later in the year, to the propaganda emanating from the Bolsheviks. But even before the February Revolution, you could see a substantial gap. It was the men who were either idle or who had less to do, or in the case of the units in Petrograd that first mutinied, the ones who were engaged in very unpopular tasks such as crowd control. That's where the mutinies tended to happen. The two critical mistakes made by the Tsarist regime, the first was simply going to war in 1914. The second mistake I think the Tsar made was abdicating. While it was true that the Tsarist authorities had lost control of the situation in Petrograd after what we now call the February Revolution, the Tsar initially ordered a punitive detachment of loyal frontline troops, the so-called St. George's Battalion, to march on the capital and to suppress the revolution by force. He was in the end once again badgered into backing down by his military advisors, and particularly his chief of staff. In the end, I think out of something like patriotic duty and self-sacrifice, he agreed to abdicate his throne on false premises, on the premise that is that the politicians had things under control.
In the midst of the great struggle against a foreign foe, it has pleased God to lay on Russia a new and painful trial. Newly arisen popular disturbances in the interior imperil the successful continuation of the stubborn fight. In these decisive days in the life of Russia, we deem it our duty to do what we can to help our people. For this reason, we, in agreement with the State Duma, think it best to abdicate the throne of the Russian state and to lay down the supreme power. May the Lord God help Russia.
First revolution overthrew the Tsar, Nicholas II, and created a provisional government.
They think, well, we've got to continue the war while loosening military discipline, because that's a Tsarist thing.
The provisional government declared absolute freedom of expression, of political activity, property rights.
This enabled the rehabilitation of a lot of political prisoners. Many of these exiles, many of whom were the most radical figures in Russian politics, were able to return to Russia in this new chaotic, freer, but also more fractious political landscape to make their mark.
The loosening of governmental regulations around political radicals allowed one such exiled radical to return: Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, who had been exiled for provoking and aiding violent revolutionary activity, seized the opportunity to return to Russia. His goal? To foment, at last, the Marxist revolution.
Lenin, sitting in Switzerland, where he'd been hanging out with like a dozen people arguing about the meaning of Marxism, is eventually helped to get back into Russia by the German regime, the Kaiser's regime. Germans, not that they wanted a Leninist regime to come into power, but they wanted the Tsarist regime to be weakened and hobbled, helped Lenin and a bunch of other revolutionaries drop him off in St. Petersburg, but also with an infusion of funds to help Bolshevik propaganda. And the Germans are willing to support this because it will help them very greatly if they can get Russia out of the war.
Lenin's relationship with his German sponsors has always been controversial and remains so to this day. Certain things, however, are crystal clear. We know that Lenin was in Switzerland when the February Revolution broke out. We know that the German consul and later the German Foreign Office arranged his return trip to Russia. They paid for the entire thing. They had officials accompany him on the train as it crossed Germany. We know that there was a kind of a front company that was involved in laundering money for the Bolsheviks. We don't know all of the precise channels by which the money got to Lenin. We do know, however, both how much the Germans appropriated, again, by their own estimates, if you were to extrapolate into current currency terms, approaching something like $1 billion US.
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
With German financial support, Lenin was able to return to Russia under the provisional government. A failed coup in July, however, forced him back into exile as a wanted criminal. But in another stroke of historical chance, Lenin would not be out of the country for long.
The problem was the war was draining Russia of resources, draining it of manpower, and the provisional government insisted on staying in the war. So as the months progressed through the summer into the fall of 1917, there was great unrest in Russia because people were hungering for peace. Well, by early November, the provisional government was basically at the end of its tether, and Lenin moved.
The October Revolution of 1917 is the one that brought Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. They were rebelling against the authority of what we usually call the provisional government, led by a man called Alexander Kerensky, who had lost a lot of popular support by continuing to prosecute the war, and who in particular had come to blows with certain members of the Russian officer corps, such that the army was no longer really willing to fight for him and his government.
Lenin comes back to Russia and tries to work through propaganda to get elements in the regime that are not very enthusiastic about the provisional government to join the Bolsheviks. And particularly among sailors and soldiers in the rear areas, and trying to get them to lose their loyalty to the regime.
They were able to flood the Russian armies and navies with massive amounts of propaganda, newspapers with daily print runs as high as 6 figures.
Because of the disparity in the calendars that Western Europe used and Russia used, sometimes you hear reference to an October Revolution, sometimes a November Revolution. And on the 7th of November, they staged a good old-fashioned coup d'etat.
Lenin's role in the October Revolution was certainly decisive. Lenin argued in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party for an immediate seizure of power.
They were a minority party, a minority movement even within socialism, even within the socialist camp in Russia. But Lenin saw the weakness of the provisional government. He saw they had no reliable support. So the Bolsheviks simply attacked. In Petrograd, Bolsheviks attacked the key communication centers, railroad stations, armories, banks, etc. They just swept in, captured these places. And when Russians woke up the next morning or a couple mornings later, the Bolsheviks were the government.
That's not to say, however, that the Bolshevik government was ever especially popular. There was a nationwide election in November 1917, and you might say this marked the peak moment of Bolshevik popularity before they had really started ruling the country. They got about 24% of the vote. Now, this was distorted somewhat by some rather impressive showings, particularly in army units that they'd heavily propagandized. But that said, more than 3/4 of the country had voted against them.
Lenin said, in retrospect, as he looked back on it, taking power in Russia was like picking up a feather. That's how weak the provisional government was. But the Bolsheviks were not voted into power. It was a minority movement that thrust itself on a majority.
With the Bolsheviks finally in power, Lenin stood poised to implement his Marxist vision. However, a civil war broke out shortly thereafter, and Lenin's vision was tested by both external threats and internal economic difficulties.
The Bolsheviks knew we need to be in power, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to do that. Encouraging the collapse of Russian armies in the field, terror used against your political opponents, which Marx had envisioned in some of his writings as this is obviously going to be necessary, we have to do this. Lenin immediately sets up a secret police. He immediately sets up concentration camps and was always very happy from the beginning to, of course, kill people who are opposing you, because a civil war slowly gains steam after the Bolsheviks take power. But also class enemies are not just eligible to be terrorized, it's right to terrorize them, it's good to terrorize them. And you have to have terror, Lenin says. You wrote this after the revolution. In some ways, the revolution makes capitalism stronger, and we have to be ready to use all of these methods, especially against small producers.
The smallholders, the people who owned only a parcel of land, fought side by side with the proletariat when the time came to overthrow the capitalists and the major landowners. But now our paths have diverged. Smallholders have always been afraid of discipline and organization. The time has come for us to have no mercy and to turn against them.
During the Civil War, Lenin actually, to fund the war, starts printing money like there is no tomorrow and creates hyperinflation in Russia to the point where people stop using money. Money becomes worthless. And there's a complete breakdown of a market economy. Lenin considers that a wonderful development. He thought, wow, this was easy. We didn't actually even have to try. And here we've blown through the stage of socialism, and we are now in the stage of communism where we don't need to use money anymore. The problem was that he nationalized everything, including farms. And in particular, he nationalized the Ukrainian farms. And Ukraine at that time was considered to be the breadbasket of Europe, a remarkably fertile land, and it was feeding a big chunk of Russia at that time. He nationalizes the farms and he says to the peasants there, we want you to turn over most of what you produce, or almost all that you produce, to us, and we're going to distribute it then to all of the people of the Soviet Union.
Lenin famously said things like, well, do you guys want to talk about morality? Morality is whatever makes the revolution go forward. And so don't talk to me about it being immoral for us to kill so-called innocent people. They're not innocent. They're part of a class that is opposing night and day what the Russian Revolution is trying to do.
The international world revolution is near, although revolutions are never made to order. The imperialists will set fire to the whole world and will start a conflagration in which they themselves will perish if they dare to quell the revolution.
Lenin had high hopes for communism in the early days after the First World War. He thought that, like Russia, many of the other belligerent countries, particularly those who had been particularly badly affected by the war, had suffered the most horrendous damage, casualties, would follow Russia into revolution, and that the Communist International would immediately be able to draw on brethren governments around the world. The Comintern is an acronym or a shortening of Communist International. So this was the organization that Lenin helped to create in 1919. It was supposed to be much more rigidly controlled, where the Bolsheviks, as the senior party in the movement, the ones who had actually seized power in Russia, would effectively give orders. They laid down what were called 21 conditions of membership. All of these conditions, some of them had to do with doctrine, some of them had to do with strategy, some of them had to do with creating shadow underground governments, some of them had to do with infiltrating the military. But effectively, the upshot of all of them was that any communist party in the world, in order to call itself the Communist Party of so-and-so country, would have to obey instructions from Moscow.
Lenin was optimistic that communism would spread to the Western world. Yet, at home, he was confronted with the harsh consequences of his domestic policies in Russia.
By nationalizing private property, industry, by confiscating private bank accounts. This led to the mass shuttering of factories, mass unemployment. By trying to ration and effectively confiscate food from peasants from the countryside, they caused many peasants to either stop growing or to hide food. All this eventually produced catastrophic conditions approaching famine across much of the country by the winter of 1920-21.
There were contemporary accounts that people were so desperate, there was despair, that they actually were engaging in cannibalism. And there were documented cases of people, in fact, eating their own children. It was that horrific. That's the situation that Lenin was looking at in 1920, 1921, where he came to realize that what they were doing was not working. The country had totally collapsed.
About 1.3 or 1.4 million Russians had died in World War I. In the next 3.5, 4 years, 25 million Russians would die in the Civil War, in the peasant rebellions, which then kind of separate from the fighting in the armies, and in the famine brought about by the war. So 18 times the number of Russians that died in a very bloody, demoralizing World War I. So mass death, brutality, upheaval, the impoverishment of not just ordinary Russians, but Russia. Before this period was over, so by the early 1920s, the war on the churches had begun, which was an integral part of Russian society, stripping them of their property, in some cases sending the priests and bishops to camps, or even ordinary believers if they resisted. So social transformation too, and sort of social chaos in addition to outright murder and mayhem.
Comrades, the Kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. The interests of the whole revolution demand such actions. You must make an example of these people. 1, hang. I mean hang publicly, so that people see it. At least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2, publish their names. 3, seize all their grain. 4, single out the hostages. Do all this so that for miles around, people see it all, understand it, tremble. Reply. saying you have received and carried out these instructions. Yours, Lenin.
A great example of Leninist brutality was how he dealt with the Kronstadt Rebellion, which was sailors who had become disaffected by Bolshevik rule, brutally smashed by military force, the ringleaders all shot, and everyone else shipped off to concentration camps. And what's really striking about this is that they had initially helped in the revolution. They were revolutionaries. It kind of epitomizes the ruthlessness of Lenin.
Kronstadt had furnished a lot of the foot soldiers of the Bolshevik Revolution, the October Revolution of 1917. A lot of the Red Guards came from there because there were naval and army units there. There were a lot of mutineers there. And so because it came from this origin point for so much of where the Bolsheviks had relied on for their popular and armed support and muscle in 1917. It was a kind of stain on the reputation of the regime. By 1921, although the Bolsheviks had seen off their military opponents and were starting to round up some of the last peasant rebels, the economy had utterly collapsed.
The food crisis has gone from bad to worse, and the working masses are starving. They no longer have the physical strength necessary to continue working. The workers are desperate and ready to take any measures necessary, unless some sort of solution to these problems is found immediately.
So he ushered in what he labeled the new economic policy in 1921, which was a reintroduction of markets. He said, in order to be able to take 2 steps forward in the future, we need to take 1 step back.
Now, Lenin himself, stubborn in many ways, he didn't exactly admit fault or responsibility, but tacitly he did. The so-called new economic policy brought back, in a lot of ways, private enterprise, the buying and selling of grain, eventually small-scale retail and manufacturing and all the rest.
The government would retain control over the commanding heights of the economy: manufacturing, heavy industry, transport, finance, international trade, but that there would be allowance made for individual ownership.
These capitalists that started their businesses under new economic policy, some of them became quite successful, and they ended up being referred to as a put down, as NEP-men, NEP, new economic policy, so NEP-men.
The way they tried to rationalize it was that communists were inexperienced and they didn't know how to run a business and they didn't know how to run an economy. And so they would hire experts and allow private businessmen to teach communists how to run businesses and how to run an economy.
But even the Bolsheviks' new economic policy, with its partial privatization of many industries, was not enough to sustain Lenin's communist experiment. Perhaps one of history's greatest ironies and tragedies is that the leading nations of the West were largely responsible for the survival of the communist system in Russia.
The reaction to the Bolshevik Revolution on the part of the West is very disappointing. The Bolsheviks, they take over, they do this vast damage. The country is economically ruined. They were saved by Western intervention. The real Western intervention that was decisive was to fundamentally not help the white armies that were trying to defeat the Bolsheviks, and in some cases undermining them. The English recognized the Soviet Union relatively quickly, opening them up for loans and things like that. And in the midst of their famine, America provided a massive amount of free food with good intentions to relieve human suffering. But what it also meant was the regime was able to survive, which it might not otherwise have been able to do.
They actually hired, among other people, Herbert Hoover, head of the American Relief Administration, to try to alleviate mass starvation in 1921.
Herbert Hoover is feeding 10 million Russians.
The food had simply stopped showing up in the cities. There was mass starvation. Even Pravda, Soviet propaganda organ, admitted that as many as 33 million people were at risk of starvation by 1921. the population of Moscow and Petrograd had declined by as much as 60 or 70%. To give you a figure of comparison, Petrograd, the population had dropped from maybe 2.5 million to perhaps about 650 or 700,000.
Lenin did not really have, at any point, a very good idea of what the economy should look like. He really did have a kind of a naive expectation that things would just sort of take care of themselves, and that it would not be a need for this centrally planned economy. That was not part of his thinking. Certainly was not something that he attempted to implement. That came with Stalin in 1928.
One of the most interesting dysfunctionalities of the communist regime in Russia, created by Lenin, was there was never a systematic process for transfer of power.
It wasn't obvious when Lenin died, do you have to have another Lenin who's really the leader in charge, no one else being able to thwart his will?
In the absence of a succession plan, Lenin's death meant that the next leader of the Soviet Union would consolidate power through brutal force, a brutality that would define the Soviet Union through World War II and into the Cold War. That leader was Joseph Stalin.